My small studio apartment was bare, just enough room for a mattress, a desk, and a few careful piles of art supplies. I was 20 years old, barely making it, stuck somewhere between the edgy art school dropout look and the I haven't slept in 3 days look. But apparently, dedication alone didn't mean much. After 2 years of trying to break into the art world, I was starting to feel the walls closing in. I'd poured everything into my work, piece after piece that I knew was good, but every door I knocked on either ignored me or slammed shut. When people did respond, they asked strange questions, gave offhand remarks about my urban style or my unconventional aesthetic. I knew what they meant without asking. I wasn't the right look, and my work apparently didn't match the right expectations either. I glanced at my bank account on my old phone's cracked screen, the numbers glaring back at me. Enough to cover rent, barely, but food was going to be a stretch. I'd been down this road before, scraping together change for ramen or sacrificing my supply budget so I could buy groceries. I felt like I was living on the edge of a cliff, and it wouldn't take much for me to fall over. I looked around at my paintings, finally settling on my most recent piece, a dark, crumbling cityscape, something I'd poured my heart into. I'd sent it out with my usual hope, thinking it would be the one. But like all the others, it had come back with a polite, not quite right for us. Frustration flared up. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I were just a little different, if I looked the way they expected an artist to look, or if my name sounded a little stronger, a little more conventional, I might have had a chance. And then a thought hit me, almost like a joke at first, so absurd it made me want to laugh. But as I sat there, the idea began to take root. What if I could be that artist? What if I created someone they wanted, someone they'd actually pay attention to? I pulled up a blank document on my laptop, staring at the empty page for a moment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I hesitated, then started typing. I needed a name, something bold and confident, something that could get a second glance in a gallery or on a wine-stained studio floor. Finally, I typed, Rod Sutler. I closed my eyes and pictured him, this tall, broad-shouldered white guy with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, someone with the kind of look and confidence that could sell a blank canvas for millions. The whole thing felt reckless, a little ridiculous, but I didn't have much left to lose. And if I could make people believe in Rod Sutler, maybe I could finally make them believe in my art too. Rod Sutler came to life that night. I set up an anonymous email account and posted a few pieces online under his name. I made a simple website, filled it with all the right language. Highbrow art speak, a few dozen AI photos, of course, a made-up bio. It was short and vague enough that no one could really question it. Rod Sutler's work is inspired by the tension between structure and freedom, the clash of natural and urban landscapes. All the kind of stuff that sounds important, like it means something, but really doesn't say much at all. I watched my inbox. One day passed, then another, and I figured it was probably just another dead end. Maybe I'd have to try something even more drastic. But then, on the third day, I got a response. It was from a small gallery, one of the ones I'd applied to as myself months ago. They'd barely glanced at my work then, told me they were fully booked and didn't feel it was the right fit. But this time, they didn't hesitate. They called Rod Sutler's work powerful and raw, asked about his availability, and wanted to know if he had a series he'd be willing to show. I sat there, rereading the email a dozen times. They'd never cared about me or my work, but for Rod Sutler? Suddenly, they were bending over backward, calling my art things they'd never called it before. I almost laughed, but mostly I just felt this strange mix of anger and excitement. It was ridiculous, but it was working. I spent the next week putting together the series they asked for. It was all my own work, the same kind of pieces I'd been making for years. But now they'd be seen through a different lens, a lens that made them acceptable. I had to admit, there was a certain thrill in this new freedom. Rod wasn't bound by the same limits as me, wasn't weighed down by anyone's judgments. I'd sold 3 pieces, just enough to get by, but it was more than I'd ever made before, more than I'd ever thought possible. The gallery wanted to set up a private showing next month. The owner was already buzzing about introducing Rod to a few key players in the art scene. I'd gotten so far on an idea that started as a joke, and now it was turning into something real. I was able to pass myself off as Rod's partner and was able to quell any suspicious glances when it became clear I was managing the business end of Rodney Sutler's success. For the first time in a long time, I let myself smile. It didn't matter that Rod wasn't real or that he was just a clever disguise. For the first time, I felt like I could make this work. And maybe this would be the break I'd been waiting for. Rod Sutler was on fire. The gallery show had gone better than I'd imagined. Every piece sold, all under his name. People were tossing around words like visionary and raw, and I even overheard one buyer call it a bold new voice in contemporary art. I should have felt ecstatic, like all my years of hard work had finally paid off. But standing there, hidden in the back of the gallery as people admired Rod's work, I mostly just felt disconnected. Rod's face was everywhere now, too, in articles and online reviews, all tied to a man who didn't even exist. Each time someone praised his unique perspective, a small part of me seethed. Rod was a hollow mask, nothing more than fake images and a fake bio. It hurt to know that all my art, everything I'd put into it, would have gone unnoticed if it hadn't been signed with his name. And then there was the constant balancing act. Every day, I'd check emails as both myself and Rod. I'd schedule meetings that I could avoid attending, interviews that I had to sidestep with convenient excuses. When gallery owners pushed for more, I dodged. It was exhausting, and sometimes I barely slept, waking up in the middle of the night trying to remember which person I was supposed to be. The pressure of keeping it all together was gnawing at me. But what choice did I have? If I dropped the act, I'd lose everything I'd worked so hard to achieve. And yet, the longer I lived as Rod, the harder it became to remember who I was outside of him. I kept telling myself it was worth it, that eventually I'd find a way to show my own face and still be accepted. But each day, it seemed less and less possible. Then, one night after a big sale, I finally let myself relax. I'd made enough money to pay off a few bills and treat myself to a decent meal, something I hadn't done in months. As I sat there in my tiny apartment, savoring each bite, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa, a friend I hadn't seen in weeks. "I heard you've been killing it lately," she wrote. "But what's up with all this Rod Sutler stuff? When did you get a partner? Didn't think you were the partnering kind." I froze, reading her words over and over. It was one thing to fool the art world, but my friends? The people who actually knew me? I couldn't lie to her, not outright, but I couldn't tell her the truth either. Not yet. So I dodged her question, brushing it off with something vague, and tried to shake the uncomfortable feeling settling in my gut. But it didn't go away. Over the next few days, more messages came in. Friends were hearing about Rod's success, about the word he'd done. People who'd ignored my art before were suddenly asking to meet, to talk about his process and his vision. Even people I'd admired for years were reaching out to him, Rod, the character I'd invented. The worst part? I couldn't even be mad. Rod had what I'd always wanted, validation, respect, even admiration. But the more he succeeded, the more he overshadowed me, the real artist behind the mask. I knew I was supposed to be happy about the success, about the sales and the praise and the money, but instead, I felt like I was slipping away, lost in a persona I'd created out of desperation. And yet, each time I thought about ending it, about coming clean, I couldn't bring myself to let go. I'd thought that pulling off the Rod Sutler act would get easier with time, that maybe I'd learn to live with it, but it was only getting harder. The success wasn't slowing down. In fact, Rod was everywhere. Galleries from New York to LA wanted his work, and collectors were calling nonstop. Each sale brought in more money, more recognition, and more praise. For him. One afternoon, I went to the gallery to pick up a check. The gallery owner, Susan, greeted me warmly. "Rod is just an incredible talent, isn't he?" she said, handing me the check with a smile. "You must be thrilled to collaborate with him. He must be an interesting guy to know." Interesting. That word sat in my mind like a stone. I'd invented this interesting guy out of thin air, and now he was all anyone could talk about. I tried to smile, but I could feel the edges of my mask slipping. "Yeah," I managed. "He's one of a kind." The longer I stood there, listening to Susan talk about his boldness and vision, the angrier I felt. It was my work on those walls, not his. Every color, every line, every brushstroke had come from me, and yet no one wanted to know about George Wilson, the real artist, only Rod. That night, Lisa texted again, asking when I'd be free to grab a coffee. I hesitated before replying. I wanted to see her, to tell her everything, but how could I? She'd either think I was lying or worse, pathetic for hiding behind a fake persona just to get people to care. I put off her message, telling myself I'd figure it out later, but I could feel my life splitting down the middle. When the next gallery show came up, the tension hit its peak. I was supposed to make an appearance as Rod, a rare chance for people to see him in person. I'd planned to dodge, send a last-minute excuse about a prior engagement, but Susan wasn't having it. "People need to see him," she insisted over the phone, her voice dripping with impatience. "He has to show his face." I was about to break under the pressure. I couldn't show up as myself, and I definitely couldn't conjure Rod out of thin air. So, in a moment of pure desperation, I told her that Rod had decided not to come, that he valued his privacy too much to appear publicly. Susan wasn't happy, but she reluctantly agreed. That night, I watched from the back of the gallery as people gathered, all looking disappointed, waiting for a glimpse of the man they'd built up in their minds. The admiration in their eyes wasn't for me, but for some fictional icon I'd created. It was surreal, knowing they'd rather see a ghost than the person actually behind the art. I couldn't sleep that night. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I knew I was in too deep. I had built Rod up to be someone he could never really be, someone that people had started to need almost as much as I did. And each time he succeeded, I felt myself shrinking into the background, like a shadow fading away. All I'd wanted was to be seen, to have my work appreciated. But now I was trapped, hiding behind a mask that had taken on a life of its own, and I was terrified that if I let it slip, there'd be nothing left for anyone to recognize as real. The turning point came when I received a knock on my door late one evening. I'd been sitting alone, staring at a piece I'd been too drained to finish, wondering if the exhaustion of keeping up the charade would ever end. When I opened the door, I expected to see Lisa, or maybe a collector desperate enough to hunt me down personally. But instead, I found myself staring into the bright, piercing eyes of Rod Sutler himself. He stood there, as real as anyone, with that confident, unshakable look I'd imagined 100 times over. His blonde hair was neatly styled. His clothes looked expensive but worn with an ease I could never have pulled off. He was everything I'd pretended he was. Strong, sure of himself, effortlessly at ease. And he was staring right back at me, a slight smirk tugging his lips. "George," he said, nodding at me as if we were old friends. I didn't know what to say or even what to think. He was an invention, a mask, a figment I'd used to survive in a world that hadn't wanted me. And yet, here he was, leaning against the doorframe, looking at me like he knew me better than anyone. I stammered, finally managing to close my mouth. Rod just chuckled, stepping inside without an invitation. He walked around my small apartment, taking in the unfinished canvases, the paint-stained brushes, the stacks of papers covered in sketches. For a moment, it was like he was inspecting my life, sizing up the person he'd been representing for so long. "I think you know why I'm here," he said finally, his gaze steady. "You've been trying to be me for so long, George, but you don't need me to be seen. You've never needed me to be real. I could barely wrap my head around what was happening, but his words cut through me, hitting every nerve I'd tried to ignore. This man, this figment of my imagination, my desperation, my lie, was standing here telling me the truth I'd been avoiding. But without you, I'd still be nothing, I argued, hearing the fear in my own voice. You're the reason they look at my work, the reason I got a chance. If I let you go, I'll lose everything. Rod shook his head, almost pitying. You're wrong. They're looking at you, George, through me. You put your soul into your work. I was just a way for them to finally see it. He crossed his arms, his expression softening. You're afraid, but that fear doesn't define you. It's time to decide if you're going to keep hiding or if you're going to let yourself be seen. I wanted to argue, to cling to the comfort of his presence, of the way he'd shielded me from rejection. But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. I had created him, shaped him out of my own insecurities, my own need for validation. And as much as I hated to admit it, Rod was holding me back now, keeping me locked in a lie that I'd let grow far beyond its purpose. Rod watched as the realization sank in, nodding like he'd known all along. I think you know what you have to do, he said, his voice softer, more understanding than I'd expected. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway with nothing but silence. The night after Rod's visit, I lay in bed, his words echoing in my mind. You don't need me to be whole. The truth of it settled over me slowly, leaving a strange, unfamiliar light in its wake. I knew what I had to do, even if it meant risking everything I'd built. The next morning, I opened Rod's email account and typed out a message to the gallery and collectors, all the people who'd only ever known me as Rod Sutler. I announced that Rod would no longer be creating or showing work, that he was stepping back permanently. Then, I did something that terrified me. I introduced myself as George Wilson, the real artist behind the pieces, and shared my own website and portfolio. I clicked send before I could second-guess myself. It felt like cutting off a lifeline, but it was also the first time in months that I felt free. In the days that followed, I waited for the backlash. But to my surprise, the response wasn't anger or ridicule. Some collectors and art fans expressed disappointment, sure, but there were also messages of support from people who admired the work itself and were curious about me. The George Wilson they had ignored at first was now on their radar, with no mask in between. My art, stripped of the facade, still held meaning. Lisa was one of the first people to reach out. She called, her voice a mix of shock and pride. So, you're telling me you were Rod this whole time? She laughed, incredulous but amused. George, I always knew you had something special. I just didn't know you'd go to such extreme lengths to prove it. Her laughter broke the last of my tension, and for the first time, I laughed with her, free of the need to hide. Over the next few months, things shifted. My name didn't carry the weight that Rod Sutler had, but that was okay. I was able to share my work as myself, even if it meant starting smaller. Some of Rod's collectors followed my work under my real name, while others moved on. But now, each time I sold a piece, I knew it was because I, George Wilson, had earned it. Looking back, Rod felt like a part of me that I'd outgrown, a crutch that had once served its purpose but was no longer necessary. He'd shown me that my art could stand on its own, that I could find an audience without pretending to be someone else. And while he wasn't real, what he'd taught me was.